Gratitude by Oliver Sacks. Gratitude contains four short yet powerful essays including Mercury, My Own Life, My Periodic Table, and Sabbath that reflect on his inner thoughts, attitudes, and perceptions of the last 2 years of Sacks's life. He begins by retelling a dream filled with shiny globules of Mercury, the 80th element in the periodic table. His dream reminds him of his upcoming 80th birthday and displays satisfaction and gratitude while reflecting on the life he has lived. Although Sacks acknowledges that he draws closer to the end of his life, he remains sparked with vibrant energy and motivation to continue exploring and living passionately. In My Own Life, Sacks announces that he has metastatic cancer and is dying. He vows that the remainder of his life must be carried out in the richest, deepest, and most productive way he can. Despite his diagnosis, Sacks continues to express complete gratitude for those who have loved him and those who he has loved as well. Ultimately, he concludes by saying his existence on beautiful Earth is both a privilege and adventure. The essay My Periodic Table delves into Sacks's love for the periodic table and its elements. He extends on his awe for the physical sciences after recalling a sky powdered with stars and venturing on a trip to North Carolina to see the Lemur Research Center. Sacks weaves his passions for science and the world around him with several stages detailing the progression of his cancer, ultimately portraying the deep connection he feels with nature along with his death. In Sabbath, written 2 weeks before he had passed, Sacks recalls his childhood within a small, Orthodox Judaism community. He describes his deep relationship he had with his mother, but sharply remembers her rejection after he announced he was homosexual. Decades later, he returns to a family reunion in Israel during the Sabbath and compares the day of rest to the final days of his life. But what is most remarkable about Sacks's life as told through gratitude is his reaction to his terminal diagnosis, which serves as the focal point of his narrative. In My Own Life, he announces that his ocular cancer has metastasized to his liver and has little time left. However, he does not dwell on his diagnosis or even the idea of dying. Rather, he declares he is face to face with dying, and it is up to me now to choose how to live out the months that remain. Rather, he views this new period of his life as a time of leisure and freedom, freed from the factitious urges of earlier days, free to explore whatever I wish, and to bind the thoughts and feelings of a lifetime together. Despite how difficult this challenge may be, he infers that accepting this notion is essential so that the final stages of one's life is not filled with misery dwelling on their death, but rather happiness and satisfaction. Sacks claims that acknowledging his own death provided him more freedom to live out the remainder of his life, including the desires to reconnect with family members and friends and pursue his interests and activities he was most passionate about. He explains that this philosophy and turning point in his life has made him feel intensely alive. Prior to his terminal diagnosis in the essay My Own Life, Sacks had almost died in a mountain climbing incident and was also diagnosed with ocular cancer. After having to face death twice, Sacks may be able to accept death more easily than the typical person. This highlights one fault of gratitude, where the act of accepting death in order to have a better quality of life may be far more difficult than Sacks displays. Because he had encountered death twice by the age of 79, Sacks was able to appreciate the value of his own life even prior to his terminal diagnosis. Before his 80th birthday, he recognizes his older age and understands that although he may not be dying, he ultimately acknowledges that his own time in his life is becoming limited. Therefore, Sacks exemplifies that directing one's life towards fulfilling their purpose is applicable at all ages, and not only for those who are terminally ill. Although this idea may seem obvious, or rather unrealistic, one would not want to live a majority of their life dealing with the day-to-day burdens only to finally be released and free as they approach death. If Sacks had not realized that he was dying or had learned of his diagnosis later on, It's possible that he would not have prioritized the value and remaining time of his life as carefully. Sacks's point of view and tone convey an interpersonal dialogue with his audience, which also indicates that it's the responsibility of the patient themselves to provide meaning to their own life. Atul Gawande's Being Mortal also focuses on the topic of dying, but advocates that end-of-life care must be reevaluated. Rather than aiming to halt or treat the terminal illness, Gawande suggests that healthcare providers should aim to provide purpose and fulfillment to the patient, ultimately known as hospice care. Comparing the two works together, Gawande's call for action also holds healthcare providers responsible for valuing the remainder of a patient's life, rather than leaving it up to the patient. Sacks's narrative and his own reflections also propose two frameworks for hospice care. First, that a terminally ill patient should be allowed to pursue their passions freely without judgment from others. Sacks himself displays this notion in My Own Life as he documents the remaining years of his life after his diagnosis. He proposes that most people would explore new cultures, countries, or try new things. And although Sacks does share some of these tendencies, he spends a significant amount of time writing, despite being a writer for the majority of his life. By contradicting his own expectation, he emphasizes that those who are dying should focus on what they individually find most fascinating so that the remainder of their lives are as fulfilling as they can make it. In the context of hospice care, withholding judgment towards a patient also includes respecting a patient's cultural, spiritual, or religious beliefs as they near death. Healthcare providers should not only support the patient in practicing these beliefs, but also implement them into the plan of care. Sacks's narrative and its reflection on end-of-life care also indicate that terminally ill patients should also be allowed to end their lives early. Ultimately, he notes that some patients may feel that they have completed their own life and no longer feel a purpose to continue. Although this idea may seem contradictory to Sacks's encouragement to live life vividly, he does recognize that death may act as a transition to peace and rest. In the last 2 weeks of his life, Sacks's final essay, titled Sabbath, encaptures death's peaceful essence. The Sabbath, the day of rest, the seventh day of the week, and perhaps the seventh day of one's life as well, when one can feel that one's work is done and one may in good conscience rest. It may come shocking to some families and loved ones when a terminally ill patient claims they no longer want to live. However, this instead may translate into a deep desire to be rid of suffering and a longing for peace. Allowing a patient to have this option may provide comfort for family, friends, caregivers, but most importantly, the patient themselves. Even thinking about one's own death is certainly frightening, and it causes the topic to be rather dismissed throughout our culture. However, Sacks's powerful narrative prompts his audience to reflect about their own lives, including their own deaths. He admits that he has some sadness and fear, but provides comfort to those who may be fearful themselves about dying. Ultimately, the way Sacks lived the final years of his life encourages others to live with complete freedom and direct themselves to find meaning and purpose. Throughout my life, I have experienced and learned about death from family members or friends who have passed away. Having to cope with death doesn't become easier, but reading gratitude has certainly brought me some comfort. Practicing Sacks's philosophy towards family members and friends helps them feel that their lives are valued. By being involved in the end of one's life, it also acts as a way to cope and ensures the life of a loved one was cherished. I would encourage others to read gratitude as well, so that death is not viewed as a time of suffering, but rather as a precious stage to be fully connected with oneself and with life.